Once upon a time, there was a woman who lived with her husband and their two sons. They were a very close family. They spent happy times and sad times together. With time, the sons grew old enough to be married, and soon their weddings were arranged, one after the other. Their wives now came to live with them. After a few months of the son's wedding, the woman's husband died, and now she was under the care of her sons. After the initial days of mourning were over, the sons went back to their jobs as usual and got busy with their lives and their wives. They began to ignore their mother, and their wives weren't too bothered about the mother-in-law either. All day long, the poor woman sat in the corner of the living room all alone, brooding and thinking about times that went past. One day, the first daughter-in-law said to the other, "Look at her. All she does is mope, 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 as if the world has come to an end." They got tired of her sitting around doing nothing and started treating her quite badly. The woman had no one to whom she could turn and tell her woes to and share her pain with. And she grew fatter and fatter as she kept the tales of woe to herself. Her sons and daughters-in-law made fun of her for growing fatter by the day and asked her to eat less. Frustrated at her life, the woman one day decided to walk away from the house. She walked and she walked and she walked till she came to an old deserted house outside of town. As soon as she entered the house, she found herself in an empty room. And she was so overcome by grief, she couldn't bear to keep her misery to herself any longer. She turned to one wall and poured out her woes against her first son. No sooner had she finished telling her tales than the wall began to tremble and shake. Dhada 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 dhamal. Under the weight of her woes, it crashed and fell down in a heap. And suddenly, the woman felt a certain lightness in her legs. She decided to go back home. That night, she talked a little to everyone, which was unusual, and she went to bed. The next day, she went back to the old deserted house. And this time, she turned to another wall and began to pour out her grievances against her first daughter-in-law. No sooner had she finished telling her stories than the wall began to tremble and shake. Under the weight of her grief, it crashed and fell in a heap. And now the woman felt a lightness come over her torso. That evening, when she went back home, she talked a little to everyone and laughed, which was rather unusual, and she went to bed. On the third day, she went back to the old deserted house, and this time she turned to another wall and began to pour out her complaints against her second son. No sooner had she finished lamenting than the wall began to tremble and shake. Under the weight of her complaints, it crashed and fell down in a heap. And now the woman felt a lightness come over her neck and her shoulders. And that evening, when she went back home, she talked a little to everyone, she laughed, and she even sang a song to herself, which was unusual, and went to bed. On the fourth day, she went back to the old deserted house. This time, she turned to the last wall standing and began to pour out her troubles against her second daughter-in-law. No sooner had she finished her gripe than the wall began to tremble and shake. Under the weight of her troubles, it crashed and fell down in a heap. And now the woman felt a lightness come over her face and her head. That evening, when she went back home, she talked a little to everyone. She laughed. She sang a song to herself. And she even offered to cook a meal, which was unusual. And she went to bed. The next day, when she woke, she looked at herself in the mirror. She found she had actually lost all the weight that she had gained in her sadness. She felt lighter in mood and in body, and a radiance had come over her face. Now, we don't know if the lady's sons and daughters-in-law changed their attitudes towards her, but we do know that the lady had found her peace because she had told it to the walls.